Bonjour tout le monde. Je me permets d'abord de me présenter. Moi, c'est Vincent Mousseau. J'utilise le pronom Yel avec les accords masculins. Je suis travailleur social clinicien ainsi que doctorant à la faculté de santé de l'université Dalhousie, située à Djibouti, Mi'kma'ki, territoire ancestral et non cédé de la nation Mi'kmaq. Où j'étudie l'accès aux soins de santé et aux services sociaux pour les personnes noires LGBTQ+, du Canada. I'm going to do that in English again. Hi, my name is Vincent Mousseau. I use they, them pronouns in English. I am a clinical social worker and also a PhD student at Dalhousie University in Djibouti, Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, colonially referred to as Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I study access to health and social services for Black, gay, bisexual, trans, queer men and other men who have sex with men across Canada. I wanted to start out with a little quote that is, I promise you, as dense as it will probably get for my presentation. It's a quote from Maurice Blanchot, who says, "The disaster ruins everything, all the while leaving everything intact. When the disaster comes upon us, it does not come. The disaster is its imminence. But since the future, as we conceive of it, in order of lived time belongs to the disaster is already withdrawn or dissuaded it. There is no future for the disaster, just as there is no space for its accomplishment." This is a lot, basically, to talk about the experience of policing that I have been able to ascertain in my research in relation to Blackness in a North American context. The disaster that Blanchot is referring to here is transatlantic slave trade. The disaster that has shifted everything about the society, our society as we understand it, including all of our institutions and including the police. And so it felt really appropriate for me, if we were going to be having a conversation about defunding, disarming and abolishing the police, that conversation has to start at the origins of the police. Much like Christina Sharp does in her book, In the Wake, I too share that opinion about the transatlantic slave trade, but I would go a bit further to make the links between the presence of Black people on Turtle Island and the punitive structures that are meant to control and surveil our bodies, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Put very simply, and with a lot of things cut out because we only do have 10 minutes, the idea of the afterlife of slavery is an attempt to justify the total dehumanization and the violence of an institution like chattel slavery. And this is where, as a clinician, as a mental health clinician, I really want to add some perspective. Treating people as objects is one of the most unhuman things that we can do. It is so fundamentally against our evolutionary biology. It's against everything that makes us human. We are social creatures. So to treat another human being as an object requires such a shift in terms of our thinking that it requires the rendering of the Black subject not to a status of subhuman, but to a status of non-human. And that's the basis for all of this. You cannot treat people as an object if you consider them still to be a human in some capacity. This institution, policing, as we understand it in the modern day, stems from one specific source, and that is the creation of runaway slave patrols in the American South. So as we understand modern policing today, the institution is directly descended from that, to the point where if you pull out your phones and you Google runaway slave patrol on your phones right now, on Google Images, the first thing that you will see is a little 6-pointed star badge that looks exactly like the badges that you see on sheriff's offices to this day. There is a continuous and ongoing legacy of that, and it served a very specific purpose. It served the purpose of rendering Black people as objects and using poor white people as a means to enforce that. That is the role of policing as it exists. Some people might say, well, in Canada, we don't have that same distinction. We're not in the US. First of all, we do. I, again, don't have enough time to go into in-depth what that's all about, but the modern understanding of policing has been exported to all of what we might call Western nations and has been enforced in that same way until this day. I think in the territory that we colonially refer to as Canada, we have to also consider the specificity of the RCMP. force that was specifically created with the goal of dispossessing Indigenous people from their land, with the express goal of maintaining their ongoing genocide. Once the paramilitary role of the police was seen as no longer being needed, once the Indian problem, as our late great what was it, McDonald at that Place du Canada, they had his head ripped off and bounced out? Yeah. The solution to the Indian problem, as he worded it, was resolved, and the police then turned into what they always do, which is maintaining the structures of anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity. Therefore, I think, considering the origins of this movement, we need to consider policing as an institution is therefore inherently black, the reform of which is completely incompatible with social movements which claim to be committed to affirming the value of black life. If we are sitting here and saying that Black Lives Matter, what we need to recognize is that for Black lives to really matter, we need to abolish all of the structures that maintain the subjugation of Black people, period. And that includes the police and includes so many other structures. For me, those calls to disarm, detask, defund, and abolish must also be rooted in intersectional Black feminist and womanist approaches, because this is where the theory came from. As Angela Davis, as I paraphrase Angela Davis, when we lift from the margins, we are able to lift everybody up. And I really want to take this moment to contextualize the fight against a generalized culture of anti-blackness is a fight for abolition, because it can't not be. It is the basis. And so if you are committed to talking about defunding the police, you are also committed to affirming the value of Black life. And if you're not, I think there's a question that you should be asking yourselves. Je pense à cet égard, et je vais switcher en français parce que je vais switcher en français. Je pense qu'il peut être facile également de se fier sur l'état de droit et sur la théorie lors de nos mouvements abolitionnistes, où on se dit bah oui, ben c'est parce que tu peux porter plainte et telle ou telle affaire, ou c'est pas dans leur droit, tu peux déposer une plainte envers toutes ces instances, ou bien tu peux agir de telle ou telle façon face aux policiers, parce que de toute façon un policier qui t'interpelle, ben il n'y a pas le droit de te demander ton nom ou whatever, ou il a le droit de te le demander et tu peux refuser de lui en donner. La question est bien différente quand tu vis la marginalisation extrême à ce point-là. Donc, on peut bien parler de légitimité de l'officier de faire tel ou tel acte, mais la réalité demeure que pour certaines personnes, cette réalité n'est pas possible. L'exemple que je donne souvent, c'est que quand je suis allé j'ai fait mes études de bac à McGill, malheureusement. Quand je suis allé à McGill, la première chose que j'avais fait, c'était d'aller à la librairie du magasin, la librairie de l'université, pour acheter un hoodie, un truc qui sort pour mes clés avec le logo de McGill. J'ai pris ma carte étudiante, j'ai mis ça directement devant mon portefeuille. Et j'étais bien content de porter ce hoodie. Je l'ai porté partout, même si McGill est une institution de merde, hyper oppressive, nommée pour une personne qui a détenu des personnes réduites en esclavage. Mais je l'ai porté parce que je ne l'avais pas porté un hoodie après la mort de Michael Brown. Et le fait que j'ai eu à considérer cette réalité-là, le fait que j'ai eu à dire « Ah, ouais, peut-être que je devrais ne pas porter de hoodie pour assurer ma sécurité » est une réalité quotidienne pour moi, pour toutes les autres personnes noires que je connais, pour toutes les autres personnes autochtones que je connais, qui ont besoin de se développer des stratégies de résilience et de résistance face à un État qui fait tout dans son possible pour nous prouver qu'ils s'en foutent de nous, en fait. Et pour moi, cette réalité-là, elle est inacceptable. Ce n'est pas une société dans laquelle je veux vivre, et moi, je veux comprendre pourquoi d'autres personnes ici qui se disent abolitionnistes ont décidé de ne pas prendre acte plus tôt. Pourquoi vous décidez de rire en pleine face d'un policier lorsque vous vivez que vous êtes interpellé, alors que ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est possible pour des gens comme moi du tout. Et pourquoi vous avez choisi de faire cette forme d'action au lieu de canaliser ces énergies envers la destruction de ce système. Vous êtes là, ça tombe bien, déjà, c'est quand même une bonne étape, mais il reste beaucoup de travail à faire. Puis ce travail-là doit, encore une fois, être basé dans une approche qui valorise les perspectives noires féministes qui ont toujours été avant-gardistes dans leur compréhension de ces systèmes. On est où, là? Évidemment, ça ne veut pas pour autant dire que, puisque le système est construit d'une certaine manière, qu'on n'est pas en mesure, qu'on ne sera pas en mesure de rien faire et qu'il faut juste être voué à l'échec, autre que si on est en train de lutter activement pour l'abolition de toutes les instances de police tout de suite. Et je pense pas que c'est une réalité faisable, en fait. Même lorsqu'on écoute les personnes qui se disent abolitionnistes, on comprend que, justement, il faut des modifications au système existant pour ne pas que le monde tombe dans une situation chaotique. Il faut comprendre également qu'il y a plusieurs personnes qui vivent dans des situations de précarité, de violence, qui sont impliquées dans les mouvements de contestation dans leur communauté, qui voient justement et qui, pour eux, la présence de la police est essentielle à leur communauté. Je ne suis pas d'accord, mais n'empêche qu'on va croiser des gens qui ont cette perspective-là. Puis comment est-ce qu'on va aborder les questions lorsqu'il vient le temps d'avoir des discussions nécessaires pour créer des vraies alternatives? Ce que l'on sait, c'est que notre libération passe par une reconnaissance que la police tire sa légitimité d'un État. Cet État québécois, canadien, fondé sur des territoires autochtones volés, bâti avec le travail forcé des personnes noires et autochtones réduites en esclavage sur ce territoire. Cet État, de sa nature même, est illégitime. Cette existence même, notre existence, notre présence même sur ces territoires-là, nous force à poser des questions quant à la légitimité de nos systèmes, de nos approches. Moi, je me demande pourquoi est-ce qu'on est en train de faire recours à ces instances. Pour moi, il ne paraît pas que c'est la meilleure chose à laquelle on pourrait espérer. Pour moi, pour envisager un monde sans police, il faut être réaliste. Pour ce faire, il faut se détourner complètement de ces structures-là qui n'ont jamais été créées avec nos intérêts en tête, puis tourner vers des structures alternatives. Je pense que c'est justement que c'est Philippe Némé-Lombré qui nomme justement, qui avait nommé dans son plus récent texte que abolir, c'est créer. Et moi, j'ai vraiment hâte d'avoir cette discussion avec vous, de savoir et de mieux comprendre comment on va pouvoir créer ce nouveau monde ensemble. Donc, je vous remercie sur ce, puis j'ai hâte pour la suite.
Hello. Oh, okay. Hey everyone, is just like if people understand English, because I can do both, or it's okay if I just do it in English. It'll just roll better, but I can speak French. So thank you, Vincent. Just like reflecting on the Angela Davis quote, I don't want to mess it up. When you
It's usually we must always attempt to lift as we fall.
Okay. So, but no, the one if we live you uplift us all.
Oh, that was me. That was me paraphrasing. But
You paraphrasing.
I said when we lift from the margins, we're all lifted up.
Well, when we live from the margins, we're all lifted up. Okay, so I'm gonna go on that because it spoke to me, and I had a lot of reflections about that. So my name is Jessica Quijano. I am a intervention worker, I guess, community intervention worker for the past 20 years. I've worked for a long time with homelessness, harm reduction, with the male trans sex worker community as a community outreach worker on the street. Worked in needle exchange, a variety of other jobs, shelters, and so forth. Most recently, I worked at the Native Women's Shelter on a project called the Ishku Project, which is a project to address the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit in Jojage here. And the project was really that when we'd have an Indigenous woman or girl go missing, I would be the person to take the police report and communicate that with the police, and as well do a lot of follow-up with the police and families and support them in trying to locate the woman. I worked mainly in the area of Milton Park, Cabot Square, a lot with the Inuit community, because those were the women that were going missing. The project started in 2017. I left in 2022. Yeah, 2022 last year. And we had 68 missing cases where 3 of them were found dead, and we still have to this day 1 missing case, Donna Perret, who went missing in 2019, who was someone who was experienced homelessness and was in the sex trade. that went missing. So I was the one supporting the family, and as well, I was the one who did the missing persons report because people on the street had come to tell me that she was missing. So I went ahead and made the missing persons report, and to this date, she's not found. That was not found. So I'm telling you all this because there's a point to it. I'm someone who has been someone who was very happy to start the coalition with other people in community who've been working for a long time to defund the police. But I'm also someone who's been in meetings and in city meetings, and I'm someone who's like voted, went ahead and for surveillance cameras and so forth, culturally sensitive training. I've seen all of those actions being taken place for many years, and participated with the status quo for many years. And this brings me to question where there's been a real shift, not only like in the kind of work that I do, but in my consciousness, and really asking myself a lot of questions on how we can evolve this movement after working with such amazing, inspiring human beings that are really, you see how the system treats them in such unjust ways, and that there's no way that I always would say if people knew what I was able to witness, people would take action. And then I'm coming back to Angela Davis's quote, because one of the things is that can people actually, they can say they want to defund the police, they want to abolish prisons. We can all agree on that, especially in these kinds of events. But are we willing as well, not just defund the police, but provide support for people that can do a lot of harm? Like I've witnessed also people a lot of suffering, but I've also seen themselves harming others, harming people in their community, harming themselves more than anything. Dealing with like very complex intergenerational trauma, abuse. Like the majority of the people that I work with on the street were from the foster care systems, didn't enter the streets of like violence, like they have been experiencing violence for most of their life. And also seeing them do a lot of harm, like as well to other people, more vulnerable people than them. Like when I say that, like I worked at a shelter downtown, Maison du Père, which was not a great experience, pretty awful actually. Like we talk about the homelessness industrial complex, like people talk about the prison industrial complex, but there is in homelessness that where we treat people like prisoners because they're living on the street, and we impose a lot of restrictions so that they can't really paternalistic, like infantilisant, like that, and so it makes them not seem like it's dehumanizing, right? Like so it really plays on the person's like self-esteem and how can they really heal from, like I'm seeing a lot of people need a lot of healing, right? They haven't even had the chance, they're so in survival they can't even heal. So it's like working in places like that where we would have like integration for men who just got out of prison, and most of them were like for sexual abuse of children, and they need to find housing or they need to find employment, and there's a lot of restrictions because they can't be near a park and so forth. And it's like, how do we, and I'm going to tell you like very honestly, like a lot of the personalities are not like exactly the most desirable or enjoyable to talk to. A lot of them are still very much in denial of what the harms they've done. Like there hasn't been any kind of like treatment that they've gone to prison, and are we going to, like, sometimes are we able in this movement to support someone who's done like sometimes extreme harm and maybe harming children, or someone who's been very violent towards their partner? Are we willing to support those peoples? Because that's like fundamentally for me one of the things with my values that I have to question. By supporting this person find housing, or supporting this person get like social assistance, or a just like have like a good quality of life, like to believe that fundamentally, I think it's really important to our movement, because there's so many times what I've witnessed is that people they are willing to support these kinds of events and come to this. But if they're a landlord and their tenant is, let's say, doing drugs, right? And they won't have any problem putting them in situations of homelessness. Like, it's just kind of like a little bit, and I could be completely wrong. You could all be very, very, very like open people, but my experience is that, you know, that people are willing to sometimes witness those trauma because it makes you reflect on your own privilege. It makes you reflect that how maybe you in the position that, whatever position that you are, what is it, it's your class or your race, what responsibility do you have towards that human being? And that's why I think that we have a lot of, like, we can talk about defunding. The police are really a reflection of us, of what it's like there is this, like, and this is really interesting because I work at Dawson College right now with young Indigenous students, and we were talking about this exact topic, and this 17-year-old told me, he's like, you know what, Jess, I believe what you say, and because it sounds true, but I like living in a delusion of safety. You know, and it really spoke to me. I was like, I've never even thought about that. I like living this delusion that these people, even though I'm an Indigenous man, if I need help, they can actually help me, help me, even though like everything you're saying is true. And so that made me really reflect of how we haven't really provided something we can actually imagine, like outside the system. Like, we're so into the system, and Vincent and I were talking about this before, like, often the response is like, let's work within the system. We have to, like, whatever it is, go to the city council meeting and do a committee and do that. But the people that this is the police brutality and police violence are the most affecting, are people who are marginalized, who are not accepted within the system. So you're asking, like, it's almost like you're asking people to do stuff within the system that they're not even a part of, that sometimes they're like, I'm not even part of that world. I live in a completely different world. And so that means that what that tells me is that if we're looking only within the system, we're not really like envisioning things in like something that can actually make people inspired to change our society. So I think that and we can like discuss, how long do we have? I don't know, like, what, chilly, okay. Just like, it's kind of like reflections, because like I have like shifted a lot since doing this kind of work, where I really feel, and this you can completely disagree with me, that we come from a very angry place, and yes, we should be angry and outraged. There's not that, but we're giving an energy of that we're receiving back. And I feel like one of the things that we're not is compassionate within ourselves, between each other, and also compassionate to people who they're not aware yet. Like, there's an awareness that they haven't reached. And this will be in Black communities and Indigenous communities and racialized and queer communities who support the police, who live within that false safety, that delusion of false safety. So how do we change those views without people feeling like shame or marginalized or not being able to access these kinds of spaces? So I guess that's like kind of like how I'm opening it. We can talk more, or if Ted has questions, or if people have questions or thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. So I'll take the opportunity to just ask each of them one question, and then we'll open it up. And so one thing that struck me, Jess, about what you said is just this focus on harm, and how the people who harm have generally been harmed themselves. And I think it's really important that we dwell on that, because the movement to defund and abolish the police isn't just an anti-police movement. It's an anti-harm movement. It's an anti-violence movement that takes as its starting premise that the police are a terrible solution to violence and to harm. They also do a bunch of things that are completely irrelevant. They could just be stopped, but sometimes they're responding to real problems, real violence, and they're doing so in a way that doesn't address the problem. And so I want to turn that question to you, Vincent, and to ask about like harm, and also in relation to gender and sexuality, which you have a lot of knowledge about, and it's part of your life. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about stopping harm, and how that relates to people depending on their gender and sexual identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So I think, as I mentioned, queerness and trans identity are like a large portion of my work. And I think it's really important to... So I would like to give you a bit of a citation if you can call it that, because I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's somewhere along the lines. From a recent report, so after the police murder of George Floyd in 2020, in Halifax, they decided to have some sort of board decision to defund a question about defunding the police, and they were asked to write a report. And this report consulted a whole bunch of communities, did a whole bunch of amazing work, and consulted and got some really interesting responses. When asked and when separated by population groups, what we were actually able to find is that 2S and LGBTQ plus identified people were the most likely to support defunding the police by a large margin. Among African Nova Scotian communities, I believe it was around 57%, and among queer and trans communities, it was at almost 80%. So there is a significant desire for that queer and trans people have, especially to talk about police defunding and abolishing the police. And I think that makes sense when you think about where our movements come from, right? Like, our movements come from an active resistance against police violence. We can think about Stonewall, yes, but we can also think about the things that are going on in Montreal. In 1990, when the SPVM, or the STQM in the time, I don't remember their acronym, who can keep track, when the SPVM went and crashed an after-hours party in Vieux Montreal in 1990, it kickstarted a whole bunch of political action in Montreal that has led to the event being referred to as Montreal Stonewall. And this is a common experience that you see across cities, across jurisdictions, is oftentimes the realities that queer and trans people are dealing with in order to have our identities be respected requires us to fight against the institutionalization of our oppression. Who is responsible for administering the homophobic and transphobic and horophobic laws that exist in our world and in our structures other than the police? Who is responsible for enforcing those laws? And so, of course, queer and trans people are going to hate the police. It feels like it comes with the territory. Unfortunately, our movements have been really co-opted by a largely white, largely cis, largely gay men experience, which has decided that being able to get married is the most important priority. But I would remind folks that trans and non-binary folks are facing a significant amount of violence in this political climate right now, in this jurisdiction, in Quebec, on a federal level, in various provinces across Canada. There are increased threats towards gender variance in a whole bunch of ways. And if we're talking about what it means for our movements to be actually anti-oppressive and to take that Black feminist lens that I was mentioning earlier, we need to also take into account that queer and trans, we need to actively center the fights of queer and trans people in these movements, because this has always been our movement. We've been fighting, and we're going to continue to fight. And I guess the question is, when we do this, how are we going to ensure that we're all on the same page, and that we're ensuring that myself as a queer person, when I show up to a mobilizing space and I might hear someone who maybe doesn't have the right terminology, use an incorrect pronoun, or use misgender me, or say something problematic, how can we continue to move past that and build networks of solidarity? So I'm thinking a lot about these questions and all of these things, and I don't have the answers, and I'm very excited to just add that to the pile of things I've been throwing at you pour un peu alimenter la discussion.
Amazing. And so I'll just turn it back to Jess one more time and then open it up. Just on that theme of thinking through gender and sexuality, I've learned a lot from you in thinking about violence against Indigenous women. So maybe that's a starting place to think about how gender and patriarchy intertwines with settler colonialism and white supremacy when it comes to the police. And if you want to start there and take it wherever you want to go.
Okay. I guess I could just speak from my experience working with as someone who has survived domestic violence, someone who has had violence in my own life, and having worked with many Indigenous women who are in violent relationship, also working with Indigenous men who are in violent relationships, Indigenous queer men that were in violent relationships, how there's such a misconception about domestic violence, and how it really can really be anyone who can experience that. But of course, when you're experiencing racism and poverty and intergenerational trauma, it really can increase the risk for violence. And how people just have a non-understanding that often when you are in a situation of like conjugal violence, domestic violence, it leads you to be violent, right? Like that's something that victims will be violent when they're experiencing violence, and how that is used, especially when there's a race dynamic, like if you are black, if you're a black man, or if you're an Indigenous woman with a white man, the police, those will completely, whether they treat you as a victim or as an aggressor. Is that like, so I just think that there's just so much education that needs to be done, and it's just like so taboo. Like I worked at a clinic for at CLSC, was Citra in NDG, and I did intake, and I was the person who used to receive the faxes from the police when the police were called, and the police have to show up at a couple's place. They would have to be like kind of get like mandatory for the woman, mandatory, it's kind of like messed up, counseling. So I had to call them to do, and it was always very, very like, I was young at the time when it was like one of my first jobs when I was working in the field. And I was like, this really doesn't make much sense, because like sometimes he would answer the phone and then I would be like, oh, can we talk? And so just me calling put the woman more at risk. And also was often like women who might have like new immigrants who came here, really situations that were really difficult, where they were just worried about now losing an income, now that he couldn't have any kind of contact with his partner, and they might have children, and the children want to see it. So it was just like a way that we're just like, us as a system, we're talking defunding the police. I'm like, defund like the system too. Like social work is like a horrible profession, and I'm a social worker, so I can tell you that the amount of harm and social surveillance that we do, and this is what it was. It was like, I'm gonna call from the clinic and tell this woman that she needs to come and do counseling. And there's no services for him too. I'm like, what about him? Like, it sounds like he would need like some help. Oh no, we can't serve him. So basically we have someone with like, who can't control their anger, or who's dealing with a variety of different things. And we're not in any way supporting him to get some kind of help, or supporting, and her, she's just like terrified. We just terrified her because she's like, I have to go meet this person. And then I would sometimes accompany them to court, and they would like be like together. They would arrive together, and I would have to be like, you have to pretend you're not together. So it's like, what are we doing? Like, what, like, it's like, as a society, why do we think it's okay to be calling 911 when we hear someone in a situation of violence? Like, why does it come to that point? Like, why haven't we done anything as a society to like identify this? And it's always also, it's so related to poverty, because I would get increases in calls when right before at the end of the month, we could totally see a pattern when there's increases in violence. So there's like solutions out there, where why are we providing more just money for people? Like straight up like money, if you're like, and something so that or why are we like telling men, or the person, the aggressor, not only men, but in the majority of the cases is cis men, who why aren't they going to a shelter? Like they can go and try to get some help there. Maybe we don't, like, why are we like moving women with their children? And it's like, I'm participating in the system. I'm like a worker here. And so I asked myself these questions because I had to get out of it. Like, I'm going to be very honest. Like, I worked for a long time, and now that I work in an institution, like an education now, which is different and has its own set of problems. But I'm like, when are we going to like step back and say what we're doing within our movements? And then it's like, nobody wants to say that, oh, we're not going to support, like, I'm not saying don't support shelters and so forth, because they're dealing with the immediate need. Like when you're hungry, having a meal is important, right? Like there's nobody, they're in emergency, they're reacting. But how can we like change those structures and look like to defund? When I think defund is to recreate something, you know, like not the same thing that isn't working. It's like we need to take a step back at all these systems, education, healthcare. We need to step back and like see how can we relook at all this, because there's a lot of things that are really wrong with it. So yeah.
Yeah, let's be honest. So on that note, we would love to have a discussion with all of y'all because I think, as I mentioned, one of the things that we have a tendency to do is to lean into these systems and say we need reform and we need all of these things. I feel like if you're here, you maybe know that that's not the best option. But what are we doing? What are we creating? Si abolir, c'est créer, qu'est-ce que l'on crée? Et moi, je n'ai pas les réponses, mais je pense que vous en avez quelques-unes, donc j'ai hâte qu'on commence à entamer une discussion. So Ted is going to have a microphone. I know that earlier in the day, people were like, I don't need a microphone, it's fine. Please, it is also an accessibility thing for folks who are maybe hard of hearing or who have some sort of limitations in terms of auditory processing. So please come up to the mic, or Ted will try to come to you if you can, but would love that.
Okay, I'll see how far I can get.
Oh, it's like one of those.
Oh, it's one of those. Oh, yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for your talk, and I just wanted to say that I really liked what you ended your discussion with, on the note that moving the men out of the house and moving them into the shelter, and maybe also because I am working with a mental health facilitation and just trying to understand and normalizing mental health issues, just like not on a personal level but on a societal level, where everyone can be like raised in such a way that you do not need to go on therapy in personal levels, you know. And maybe it's just because I'm also working with people like for a long time on a personal it's a very small online service. I talk to people whoever is in need, and I see this pattern that a lot of men also want help, need help, but they are just not able to like ask about it. And like there's a stigma, and it's also on the other end that we feel that if there is like some issues going on, we have to move the children and the women out of the house, but we are not like being neutral on what we are judging in the situation. So just we are seeing like we are making the decisions on a gender-based level, not on a personal level. So I think we should make the system of not like jail for men and shelter for women kind of thing, but like shelter or justice for the victim, and shelter and reformation for the abuser,
Yeah.
instead of jails.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because when we put the aggressors in prison, we just increase the risk of a woman getting murdered, like
Well,
in and out of the
exactly.
system, because you're recreating a trauma. So like it's just and at the end of the day, we're talking about healing.
Yes.
And allowing people to heal, and sometimes that's about having compassion towards people who sometimes harm. And so I think that that's where I'm kind of coming from. Like, I think that there's sometimes a really big lack of compassion for, please don't get, for abusers.
Yes, exactly.
Because they're hurting others, but they're hurting more themselves. Like, being an abusive, violent person is not a nice
Not fun.
life. It's
Exactly.
not. It's not something. It's like, oh, and if you are a man who does not have money, you will not get any help. There's nothing accessible. So we just set people up to fail, where they have like this trauma, and they want to be able to get some kind of skills or to be able to cope with it, but we're not providing anything.
Yes.
I think I might also add that a lot of our resolve to lean into systems, like especially the carceral system, ignores a very fundamental reality that I think is required in abolitionist movements, which is the fact that every human life has value. That should not be a controversial statement, but and I think it's very easy for a few folks to say, when I say Black Lives Matter, we are able to engage with that concept theoretically. Do you believe that the life of the person who violently abused XYZ other person has value? If not, why? Whose judgments are being made in that, right? And is our goal actually to punish people, or is it to create a society in which we're moving past that level of punishment and moving towards justice and and creating a society in which those things are not happening in the first place? I'm very interested in conversations around all forms of intimate partner violence as someone who's also experienced that. But I also recognize that an essential part of that is recognizing that people are hurt and people engage in hurt when they are hurt. And that is unfortunate, and it's very difficult to make a society in which. And it's very difficult to engage in a conversation, and I think this is the really hard part about a lot of the abolitionist or defund work around saying, like, hey, I think that that person who abused X number of people has a right to access repair, like, services that are going to make it so that they don't do this again, right? And unfortunately, in our society, that is a bit of an uphill battle. So I guess I'm like reflecting a lot on that, but I appreciate a lot of the reflections, and I especially like when you said that, like, the dynamic is only based on our perception of gender, and like the whole system is structured around that. And I think that's it's a necessity, especially for queer activists and trans activists, to like undo that work as well, and to undo that idea of like the female victim, the male aggressor in this way, so that we can actually address all of the people who are perpetrating and who are living situations of intimate partner violence. And thank you for your work also.
You're most welcome. And I also wanted to add that when we are talking about like shelters, we just think of like maybe food, clothes, and education, but we do not really work on the mental health that comes from an abusive household relationship, or like, you know, being a kid of an abusive parental relationship, which is really important. And also the abuser, we really need to understand why that abuser is like abusing someone the way they are, so that we can understand them better, and maybe not just putting them into jail, but like putting them into the rehabilitation center for understanding themselves, and trying to see if we can make them a better person by providing help before just like totally reaching out for the law. And I think there is one thing where it comes to the defunding police, because we are giving the police the power to just like, you know, ambush someone, or like just you know, like just get them like grounded on the fact that whatever they have done, but not taking the account of all the other human factors they might have been through, which made them to deal with that. I'm not justifying that, but I think we should also take that into account, and the policing should come at the later stage, not at the first stage. First, we should take with the human resources we have, and like make this kind of action like very fast, and not going through the whole judicial process, like you go to the court, go to the police, and it's like a whole kind of like, you know, total mess. Oh yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, I talk a lot. So I think it's really important that we really start addressing the issues, and like do the activism first, and like take the person to the shelter who is being abused, or the abuser, understand what they're doing, and then comes the policing. So also they have like less impact on people's social life, just as a general. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Anyone else?
If I can just add a little thing in before this, but yes, please add this person, or a couple of people with questions, I guess. But I think it's also really important to remember when we talk about policing that, like, for me, anyway, in this perspective, like, I don't know that it's possible to reform this system as it exists. And so when we talk about, and I don't even know that that's something that we would want to do. Why would you want to reform a system that is the literal descendant of the runaway slave patrols? And whose interests does it serve to maintain those systems? And so I believe that we definitely need to be having conversations about this. And I also think it's very difficult because we do have situations in which police intervention is unfortunately something that we are going to have to confront. But it's essential for us to think of policing to think about solutions beyond policing, I think, is one of the main things that I would say in this. Sorry about that.
Yeah, je vais parler en français. Je suis plus à l'aise en français. J'ai la tourette, donc je vais faire des sons et des faces pendant que je parle, mais je suis correct. J'ai eu une discussion récemment avec un de mes amis qui est pas nécessairement abolitionniste. Et il y a une question qui m'a posée que j'ai trouvée, mine de rien, plutôt pertinente. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec les policiers quand on a aboli la police? Ce que... J'aimerais ça entendre votre avis là-dessus, mais j'ai mes propres pensées sur cette issue. Je pense qu'à la fin, ça revient beaucoup à, justement, l'entraînement que les policiers ont vécu, c'est du conditionnement psychologique. C'est les policiers, à la fin, c'est des gens à qui on a montré que la violence a une définition particulière, que la criminalité, ça a une définition particulière, et c'est des gens qui ont le droit de définir c'est quoi la culpabilité et c'est quoi la violence, et de rencontrer justement ce qu'ils appellent la violence avec de la violence qui est institutionnalisée puis qui est normalisée. Puis ces personnes-là, pour être réintégrées dans la société, ont besoin de thérapie, ont besoin d'être justement réformées parce que, je suis désolée, mais la réalité, c'est que la plupart des personnes ne sont pas en sécurité à proximité d'un policier et ces gens-là ne peuvent pas revenir dans la société et juste sans... Surtout que le milieu policier est un milieu tellement patriarcal que comme juste le fait de parler de problèmes de santé mentale, et on sait qu'il y a un overlap immense entre la violence interpersonnelle dans les vies personnelles des policiers et ben, justement le métier de policier. Je commence à m'emporter, fait que je vais vous laisser répondre à la question. Merci.
Maybe we could get a couple comments.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Hello, thank you. So, a couple of reflections. I'm from Tunisia, and we really hate the police. And the reason is very similar. We inherited from a colonial police system. So, in French, it's les gendarmes. So, you know, African genre is extremely complex, has extremely complex history. So, there are layers and layers and layers of oppression and colonial layers too. So people are organizing themselves without the police by design, because we don't trust the police. It's the police. We know the police is not for us. It's for either those who are replacing the le système colonial or la bourgeoisie and so on. So when I heard you say what to do next. And something I feel a lot here in the West is people are trying to recreate something new, but all over the world there are other experiences, and I feel even in our movement some kind of arrogance, I have to say, like, or at least thinking that everything needs to be recreated. And for me this is very modern idea, right? So if you go to Africa, if you go to India, even in South Korea, like, people have found solutions, and I think we need really to connect and reconnect, and be humble when trying to think about any kind of future, because this is crossing the Western mindset, thinking that okay, I will own the future, but in fact, you know. You can learn from us too. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
Je peux-tu? Do you mind if because I'm going to lose my train of thought. D'abord, je voulais justement dire merci justement par rapport à votre intervention. Je me dis lorsqu'on me pose la question, quoi faire avec les policiers après l'abolition, je me demande d'autres questions semblables, genre quoi faire avec les gens qui travaillent dans les sables bitumineux après qu'on continue la transition écologique, si on réussit à agir à temps. Et je pense que la réponse à ces questions est souvent les mêmes, parce que ce sont justement des milieux qui sont ultra violents, ultra misogynes souvent à plusieurs égards, et qui reproduisent justement des formes de violence constamment. Et je pense que il faut également considérer, il faut agir de la même manière. Donc dire justement cette formation, si on arrive à un point où on va être en mesure d'abolir la police, c'est parce qu'on a compris pourquoi la police est mal. Donc, je me dis également, après ça, on devrait également être en mesure d'expliquer ou d'expliciter au moins pour les policiers pourquoi on a aboli leur milieu de travail, et de leur présenter des alternatives, si on peut considérer l'oppression comme milieu de travail, ce que je ne considère pas, mais bon. I also wanted to get back to this question. I think I had a few things when you were mentioning this. I think at a place where 99% of people hate the police, how do they still exist, right? So we can understand that the police do not exist through some sort of social contract by which we justify their existence because they are good for people. We know that they exist then because they reinforce a violent status quo that is rooted in oppression and marginalization and violence and all of these things. And they are operating as the arm of the state, essentially. The state is the only one who is allowed to engage in political violence. It does so through its police and military and all of these institutions. And so, of course, the police is going to continue to exist. But I agree with your diagnosis 100% that we've ignored, and I think our movements around defund in quote-unquote Western, whatever that means, societies has reproduced a lot of the same colonialist norms where we ignore the fact that there are other ways of doing things that exist and have existed and will continue to exist despite us. We just don't know about them because we have our heads so far up our own butts. The kids? Cool. Okay. I also want to make a link between this idea that, yes, it's a colonial construct, but it also doesn't recognize the nature of marginalization in our own communities right here. And so this is where I would bring the link again back to black queer communities when I think about ballroom. Maybe folks are familiar with ballroom culture, kiki, all this stuff. If you don't, you've probably seen a bastardized version of it on RuPaul's Drag Race or something with the yes, you better work, all of this stuff. All of these tools are tools that are sourced from black trans communities, disproportionately black trans women, trying to create environments where they could feel safe in order to express their gender and to affirm their place in society. Vogue, as you might be aware of it, is actually a way for communities to settle disputes. It's how it began. When you had something going on with other people, you'd bring it to the floor because there's no way that in a society that is so violent against us, we're going to reproduce that same violence. And so the way that we responded to that was through dance. And by celebrating that through dance and creating culture. Fait que quand je dis abolir, c'est créer, je parle de ça. Et je parle aussi de toutes les belles choses qui pourraient venir lorsqu'on ose dire on n'a plus besoin de cette structure, on va pouvoir créer. Et lorsque l'on crée, regarde la beauté qui peut en venir. Regarde les connexions que vous avez pu faire entre vous juste ici. Ça existe parce que quelqu'un a osé dire on n'a plus besoin de ces structures-là. Puis il y a une beauté extrême dans ça. Puis on doit également valoriser ça, puis considérer l'impact de ça, et également de respecter ces cultures-là. Fait que si je vous vois en train de faire des yes, manque de respect comme ça, là, c'est non, c'est coupé.
Okay, I'll keep it short. I mean, coming to your question about police, I mean, we're just going to have to, you want a practical answer? We're just going to have to pay them till they're retired because at the end of the day, they've been harmed. And they have probably PTSD, and so yeah, that's what it is. We're gonna have to go respond with compassion because they're human beings too, and they've experienced violence. That's just my answer to that. And yes, you're completely right about how there's so many things that already exist. And even when you think about Indigenous justice or how the communities have there are already things going on, right? There's some communities up north where it's they've taken away the Western justice system, and when someone harms in the community, they have the elders, they have a circle to decide how are they going to be accountable, and it will be things like fishing for everyone in the town. It's about doing certain things, and that's a very way of that's existed for in thousands of years, and we see this in other cultures too. There's accountability to the community. And so that can really, and that the community is there for you. It's like the opposite of what we do, how we marginalize, how we kick people out of communities when they've done harm. It's it's for us to know that this person has harm. We have to do something for this person to heal. And that's really natural, actually. That's something that we all have as human beings, but we've been convinced that we need to use these structures when it's really in us as it is.
Hi. Yeah, that actually was a great transition into my question. And also that was amazing to hear about voguing being part of solving conflict. I'm a drag performer, and to hear that that's part of that history is really beautiful. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this idea of a punitive mindset when dealing with conflicts within the community, and also like interpersonal violence and intimate violence, especially within queer communities. Because there, as you said, there's a lot of support within queer communities to defund the police and to have radical politics. But I have seen over and over again that within queer communities, there's so much conflict and so much like a desire to immediately go to pushing people out, to like canceling them, not to bring in, I guess, cancel culture. But how I've seen like the exact people who are at the protests, like spitting in police faces, they're equally ignoring the people who supposedly have caused harm to their friends, banning them from pride marches, making them not feel safe in those communities enough that those same people who have been accused of violence end up leaving that area and community altogether, and there's no actual healing that happens, and it just replicates over and over again. So yeah, just bringing that into the conversation, and how it's like people who are for all of this, but then still it's like ingrained in our minds as how we approach things outside of those systems too. So
yeah, activism is very famous for that, excluding people, having incredible judgment towards people making mistakes. However, they will, like, it's really interesting to me and unfortunate, because sometimes I bring people to rallies that have been convicted of murder, have sexually assaulted, and they're just there because they're the ones who've been part of this system, but we're kicking someone out who hasn't even really honestly done a fraction of what the person I'm with, but and for some way they'll rationalize it that it's okay. So to me, it's saying that you're putting more value on your peer than the people most affected. You think you're like, they can, of course they're going to act that way. Again, paternalistic, patronizing. Oh, of course they act that way, but this person can't make any kind of mistake. So I think it's, and it often comes back a lot to ego, which is like sometimes very egotistical, but thank you. I'll let Jason, what his thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. I agree, and I think you only need to take one look at Chez Queer Montreal on Facebook to know that, like, sometimes we're not the most progressive in some ways. I think I really want to bring this to this idea of, I want to go back to this idea of our shared humanity, if that's okay. And it's a little bit tangential, but I promise it's related. It's just something I really think it's important to leave us with as we run out of time. So when I do client-facing work, the first thing I do is like try to explain to people what's happening in their bodies when they feel anxiety or depression, or that response when you're trying to say like, hey, like this conflict is something I really don't like, and you respond in ways that you maybe wouldn't respond in other ways, in other situations. I try to explain to people why that's happening. So I'd like to share that with you, if that's okay. But essentially, the shortest way I can explain this is when human beings evolve to walk upright, a few things need to happen to our bodies. Our hips have to narrow in order to be able to ambulate on two legs, but we also need to our brain also gets larger. This also happened at the same time that we were developing language, and so language processing takes up a large portion of our brain. So, larger brain, smaller birth canal. You seeing what I'm getting at here? So, in order to pass through the birth canal, every human being must have a head that's small enough, and therefore cannot have too much brain development. That's why babies' heads are so soft. That's why it takes like all of this time. And the reason I bring this up is because we are not able to survive on our own. It's not possible. It is literally fundamentally against the core of human biology to imagine that we could exist without a society, that we can exist without at least someone to support us, a family unit, a community, whatever that moment is. We're also the creature with the longest developmental lifespan at 25 years until we're fully developed, at almost a quarter of our lifespan for some people. How could we then think that this creation of an hyper-individualistic society where everyone is looking out for themselves, and we need to have these police officers that come in and who regulate conflict, like, why have we become so disconnected by the social structures that we've created around us from our core human nature that we are not ever going to be able to come to that solution. And as long as we don't accept our nature as social beings, and the idea that all of us around here are coming at our life experiences with our own unique lived experiences and family histories and everything that comes along with that, then how could we ever imagine creating a society in which we're able to deal with the complexity that would be required to deal with interpersonal conflict? It seems unreasonable to me. And so I think a great way to end any conversation is one that is rooted in our shared humanity, in this idea that we are all together here looking for connection with each other, looking to create a world that is not rooted in violence and oppression and anti-blackness and homophobia and transphobia and all the other isms and phobias that exist, but rather just because we fundamentally believe that as a species we can do better. And if that's not the center of our movement, then I don't think I'm interested. And yeah.
I think that's a fine thought to let percolate in our heads as we walk towards dinner, some music. So the goal of this was to have a discussion. We've only just gotten started, but we have the rest of the evening to have that discussion informally with some food in our bellies, with some music playing. And so I want to thank all of you for being here, and I especially want to thank Vincent and Jessica for sharing these thoughts, getting us going, and so join me in giving them applause. Yeah. Thanks everybody. So obviously the food is over there, and the music will be playing somewhere over there anytime soon.